Those of you who are joining us, please make sure you're muted. Great. Thanks for joining us for the Deis Open Roadmap meeting. This is for the v1.11 release. We got a lot to share this week. We're going to be talking about some stuff that happened in the last release, the 1.10 series, and also share some news about sort of the future of the project, and then dive into the typical roadmap update. One other thing we're going to be doing today is we're going to be following up with a demo of a new project we have that should be pretty cool. So I'd like at this point to hand it over to Chris Armstrong, the Deis team lead, to talk about where we're at with the 1.10 release and some of the things that we were able to ship.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. If you're at all familiar with the project, you know that we are late for 1.10. We hit some last-minute issues with that CD that we are ironing out. We want to make sure that every cluster that's deployed is production grade. So that should go out today. The two big things to note for version 1.10 of Deis are internal rewrites, which does not sound that exciting, but they are hugely impactful. The builder was rewritten by our own Matt Butcher to be Go-based. If you're familiar with Builder, it's been a hobbled together massive bash and shell scripts that make it incredibly hard to test. And when there are issues with it, it's hard for contributors to kind of dive in. It's kind of hard to see how all of these separate scripts tie together. So the builder, completely rewritten in Go. It's more resilient, more reliable, more easy to test. So pretty awesome. When we ship that today, we'll be able to close a bunch of old bugs related to builder. And the second of which is another Go rewrite for the Deis client. For a while now, you may not have noticed that the client was even in Python. We ship it as a self-extracting archive. So you don't even really need to know that it's running Python, but if you try the client for Deis 1.10, you notice it's substantially faster. The client has been completely rewritten in Go. Again, better testing, better performance, and just all around better. So those are the two big things we ship for this release. The other thing to call out, which isn't a feature, but it is pretty important for our contributors, is that DigitalOcean is now the preferred development experience for Deis. They are sponsoring free DigitalOcean credits for contributors to the project. So that's pretty awesome. There's a blog post about it. It'll be linked to in the release notes as well. But I encourage everyone to get some free hosting from them. Those were the big things I wanted to call out in this release. I'm looking at the pending release notes now. We bumped a few other things. Nginx is now 1.9.4. That addresses a potential, I think it was a memory leak. It was a performance issue. I know that a few people reported issues with Nginx just kind of growing in resource consumption. So I'd encourage people to upgrade as soon as this ships. And then, the other big thing we'll be talking about with the demo later. So I'll leave that for the demo. But that's Deis 1.10.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And a couple of the other things I'm personally excited about in the 1.10 release. We did manage to ship support for isolated etcd clusters, as well as documentation on how to do that. Same thing goes for isolated control plane, data plane, router mesh, all that stuff landed in the release. And that's pretty important for some of the larger scale production deployments. And a big thanks to Kent Rankert on the core team for getting that across the finish line. In the 1.10 series, as Chris hinted, we did come across a couple of bugs. The big reason why we're delayed right now actually has to do with the etcd discovery rendezvous service having an outage yesterday, which kind of dragged our last minute testing to a halt. But we're also kind of struggling at this point with some Docker bugs. For those of you who are aware of kind of the Docker versions that we ship, we're pretty far down rev in terms of what Docker we're shipping. And this has to do a lot with the registry v1 versus v2 registry on the Docker side. So some priorities for the next release, making sure that we get up to good quality revs for Docker, as well as getting that move to the registry v2 APIs. There's a lot of things in some of the newer Docker engines that we want, specifically in 1.7. There's a completely new networking subsystem, and I think that that we can definitely benefit from that, especially now that it's had some hardening. We're also looking at ways to work around and increase the stability of etcd. Those of you who have worked with Deis know that etcd is really a foundational piece of the platform, and we're always looking for ways that we can improve stability, make sure that we can recover from degradation, failure modes, things like that. We're going to be experimenting with switching to watches, though. It was from polling, which is what we're doing kind of throughout the platform today, though. I was recently informed that the etcd watches in the etcd2 API fire on TTL triggers. So, for example, we use TTLs throughout the platform, and if the watches are firing every time a TTL changes, that's not ideal for us. So I believe that behavior is different in the v3 API, but so I don't know how much benefit we'll be able to get there. Another thing we're going to be prioritizing for 1.11 is trying to move the Kubernetes scheduler to our recommended scheduler. And I see that as kind of a step short of the new default scheduler. Folks who are running Deis at scale today, who've tried the Kubernetes scheduler, have already realized that it's a lot more stable than Fleet typically, and it also provides a lot more scale. And we want to harden that to the extent we can harden what we have today, and move this into sort of a recommended stage. And the last big priority right now for the next monthly cycle is getting the stateless logger into place. Many of you running on AWS have been extremely enthusiastic about how well the Cephless version of the platform runs, the stability of that platform. One of the things that it's missing is a logging subsystem where developers can actually query logs. And we actually got a pull request from a community member to add a stateless logger with an in-memory ring buffer for storage. And that's something that we want to get into the next release, and it seems pretty close. So those are some of the priorities for the next release. At this point, I want to shift gears and talk a minute about kind of the future of the project, and introduce the concept of Deis v2. And what does that mean exactly? So just for a little bit of background, we've done a great deal of work experimenting with different scheduling and orchestration systems. Docker Swarm was the first one we really poked at pretty significantly. We have a great deal of experience with Mesos, Marathon frameworks, Aurora, and other custom frameworks, and also with Kubernetes. And it's become clear to us that because Fleet is not a resource-based scheduler, and because it can have problems with sort of unit balancing across a cluster, we really have been looking for a new scheduling and orchestration system upon which to build the platform. And we believe at this point it's safe to say that Kubernetes is the way that we're going to be moving forward. And when we say Deis v2, what we really mean is a Deis platform that is sort of has as a requirement an underlying Kubernetes. And that is really the only requirement, is that there be a Kubernetes infrastructure upon which we can start to load some of the Deis units, and then have Deis in turn driving the Kubernetes platform. So that's really the goal for what Deis v2 is. I do want to for those of you who are running Deis today in production, and there are a lot of you, I want to make clear that we are very well aware of making the v1 to v2 migration as painless as possible. So we're going to be working overtime to make sure that that migration is smooth, and that folks aren't disrupted. And in fact, where it's possible for us to not break APIs, we're going to not break APIs. And if this can just be simply Deis now, just with Kubernetes as sort of the required orchestrator, that would be the preference. So with that sort of introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Matt Butcher, who is leading the work on Deis v2 and the Kubernetes integration, to talk about sort of where things stand.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So the big approach we've taken is first of all, we want to honor the semantic versioning that we've committed to, right? So there are a lot of changes, minor changes that we've held off on until v2. But the impetus, the is Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is going to change the way that we can run this platform, and we're really, really excited about the way it's starting to shape up. So over the summer, we've been pulling a couple of experimental projects to just sort of feel out how things could work. And we like what we're finding. We're finding that Kubernetes can get us a long way down the road to providing some of the services that we really want to be able to provide, but also a level of robustness that we were really struggling with trying to achieve with Fleet and other schedulers. So what we've decided to do is begin by attempting to rebase the entire Deis platform on top of a Kubernetes cluster. And we want to start by kind of going, we don't want to touch Kubernetes, right, to require you to make a lot of configuration changes to how Kubernetes runs or share a lot of data between it in unorthodox ways. So what we're trying to do is make it possible to just install Deis straight into an existing Kubernetes cluster. And that is one of our big design goals. And of course, that means that we'll make it easy and possible for you to stand up an entire Kubernetes system with Deis running inside of it. But we also want to be able to deploy into targets like Google's container engine, into platforms like Tectonic, and make it just really flexible so that you can install it into the environment you want. So goal number one has been to start shifting components into Kubernetes, into a pure Kubernetes, and run it successfully in that environment. Along the way, there are projects that are bigger than others, right? A lot of the pieces will stay the same. Some, like Deis control, which we use to stand up a Deis cluster, will have to go through a fairly major rewrite because it's going to be targeting a new platform. But also, we've taken this opportunity to do some stuff to really harden aspects of the platform and strengthen some of them. So two examples of that coming up here. Our Postgres, that we're working to make an HA version of Postgres to run inside of Kubernetes. And also we're taking the opportunity to rework some of the core features of the builder to make the builder much more secure and capable of running inside of an existing Kubernetes document with, existing Kubernetes structure without requiring you to grant it a high level of permissions or privileges. So what I'm going to do is first hand it over to Matt Fisher, who's working on the HA Postgres, and then he will hand it on to Sivaram, who's been working on the builder, and each of them will introduce and tell you what they've been working on that platform. Then after that, I'll come back and we'll talk a little more about what this means for the community. Okay?
Alrighty, we ready? Okay, so I'm Matt Fisher. I've been working on a couple of different things for V2 of Deis, and one of them specifically has been Postgres. So in V1, how Postgres works is that it's just simply a Postgres database, and we wanted some kind of fault tolerance so that if it did or it came down, your data would not be lost, basically. So how we did that before is that we'd be using a project that I believe Heroku created. It was called Wally. And what Wally does is basically it ships off wall logs from your Postgres database off to a S3 compatible store using either Amazon S3 or for those of you who are using a Cephalus cluster, or it goes to the Ceph Rados gateway. So when the database goes down eventually, what it'll be able to do is when it comes back up, it'll just replay the logs and then everything comes up. Now, the problem with that right now exists in that there's a really long time of downtime, about half an hour, 15, 20 minutes for it to replay every single log back, and then it comes back up. With the new approach, which we get with Kubernetes, is that we're able to run a couple of them in a master-slave replication way. And so what I've been experimenting with is a way to be able to run not just one instance of the database, but a couple, and where one becomes primary slave or primary master, and that's the one that routes requests and everything, and Kubernetes listens to that. So all the other components from the control plane will be able to talk to that one thanks to Kubernetes health checks. All the other instances become automatically slaves of that instance and are now just do streaming replication. So if a master does come down for some reason, one of the slaves can instantly take over and become master automatically promoted. And because of the health check feature inside Kubernetes, requests will now get routed over to that slave, which is now master. And because of the replication controller, the old master, which is now died, will come back up as a slave of that new master, and the slaves are now redirected to the other one. So that's what I've been working on basically, is being able to tune the Postgres or database so then it's fault tolerant and highly available. Right now I'm on the highly available part, but I'm still working on the fault tolerance. So if all three come down, then your data is completely gone. But I'm working on that. So that's what I'm on. Sivram?
Yeah. So as Matt Butcher okay, I'm ready. Okay. So as Matt Butcher explained that we are trying to run away from running builder from privileged mode. So we did some experimentations with QEMU, running QEMU with KVM, but as you know, KVM requires the host hardware configuration, and also it should access your devices. So again, it needs privileged mode. So we actually thought of running a very lightweight Linux kernel. So we compiled our own version of boot to Docker ISO, which doesn't require TLS configuration for running your Docker engine. So right now we are starting boot to Docker inside QEMU, inside a container. So you can, and we are forwarding the host port to the container. So it doesn't require another virtual Ethernet interface to set up. Yeah. So that's it.
So if you're keeping score there, that is running a Docker builder process inside of a virtual machine running boot to Docker inside of a container inside of Kubernetes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like there is like, if you think about how networking stack builds up, it's like you'll end up in 7 different layers of networking in the same machine. So yeah. And like in the future, like we might, right now, so it has some performance issues when compared to running in a privileged mode. Because boot to Docker is a very lightweight Linux container, Linux operating system that runs Docker, and it boots up in 10 seconds fairly. And in the future, we are also thinking about decoupling some builder into 2 or 3 processes, so that one will be handling the request and the other will be building the container and throwing the tar file to the requested service. So which might improve the performance issues. And if customers are using CoreOS clusters, then CoreOS comes with Rocket and LKVM support. So using Rocket, we can run builder as LKVM stage 1, which actually starts a isolated builder hypervisor instead of builder container. So it's actually very secure in running. So we are actually looking forward for that as well. So users can run, like if they're using a CoreOS machine, CoreOS cluster, then they can choose to run builder using Rocket, or like this is like in the future, but not yet implemented right now. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so it's a really exciting thing. Both of these things are really exciting for us because we feel like we've identified some cases where we can make some definitive improvements in the way the platform works, in security and performance, in scalability, and in fault tolerance. And so that's going to be a huge focus for us. I kind of started out by saying, we take Semver very seriously, and we're hitting a 2.0 mark, which means we sort of have permission at this point to change some APIs. And Kubernetes is a Greek word, right? So now I'm all hooked on Greek mythology. And you get this story in the Odyssey where Homer's trying to go between the monster Scylla and the monster Charybdis, and there's this kind of narrow gap between the two where he has to skill the ship through it, right? He's the Kubernetes in that case, literally. And I think that when we hit these 2.0 marks, there's a huge danger in steering one way toward one monster and the other way toward the other, right? In this case, one is staying too close to what we were doing, and the other is going way out in left field. But I think we can find the right path here. And so what I would really like, now that we're really openly, past the experimentation phase and we can really start talking about V2, this is a great time for community feedback to say, look, these are the things that we really, really feel would be great things to have in a version 2. These are things, API changes that would make life much easier. keep them realistic, keep them, kind of in scope. But we're at that time right now where we would love some feedback into things that you would really like to see make their way into a V2 platform that simply wouldn't fit into V1 given the SEMVer constraints. So I wanted to kind of leave it off with that, and I'm going to hand it back over to Gabe.
Great, thanks, Matt. Exciting stuff. Very much looking forward to seeing sort of the branch and some of this out there publicly, so folks can weigh in and start helping contribute. So with that, I'd like to just jump into the standard roadmap update. So I'm going to pull up the on docs.deis.io. Over on the right, the roadmap nav bar, and then the Deis roadmap link there. And we're just going to go through these items one by one and have some folks on the team talk about where things are at. So the default scheduler, I kind of touched on this before. The goal right now is, V2 is going to be basically the new default scheduler. That's where, we are going to make the change from Fleet to Kubernetes. It's going to be required. In the meantime, I think we're going to be looking at hardening the Kubernetes scheduler that we have now and making it sort of a recommended scheduler, in order to make sure we have a smooth transition from the 1x to 2x lines. So for permissions and teams, I'd like to hand that over quickly to Matt Boersma.
Hey, so you can see what's linked there in the roadmap, but real quickly, the idea is right now we have just a basic permission set that you can ascribe to individual users. We can roll that up into teams, and then you can have people be members of teams. We can assign the permissions to the teams all in one, which would be much more convenient. And then the thing underlying that is, we only have basic permissions right now. We need to make it a little more fine-grained so we can break it up with, we can make managing certs a separate permission. Managing apps is essentially all we do right now, so that would be a separate permission. But we could break that up into, certain users should only be able to change config, but otherwise leave the app alone. Maybe they can't get pushed to it, but they can only change config variables. So that's the general idea. There's more detail in the two PRs that are linked to. We're really hoping to get to this for the next release, although there's quite a bit of work to do. So.
Great. Thanks, Matt. For monitoring telemetry, Chauncey, you want to share a little bit about where we're at?
Yeah, so we're still kind of experimenting, poking around, trying to figure out what it is we want to ship as part of Deis, what it is we want to, kind of what do we deliver to customers and what we expect from their end in the installed platform. So, and also we're right now spending a lot of time with kind of the Deis Pro or the support side of things. So customers can sign up and get kind of a proactive support. So part of that's like up-down checks and things like that. So trying to figure out how to handle both sides of that and ship kind of a unified system into Deis. So, but things are going pretty well, and hopefully we'll have some more to show you guys here soon.
Great. Thanks, Chauncey. Kent, over to you for production hardening.
Yeah, so we had 2 items related to production hardening that were on the roadmap. One had to do with isolating etcd to a small fixed number of nodes. That's mainly been addressed through documentation. The other was isolating your control plane, also basically to a small fixed number of nodes. That's been addressed through a combination of documentation and some updates to the Deis CTL tool. So both of these things are closed out in v1.10. One thing that's not in place yet is we don't have a provisioning process in place that actually implements the recommendations that are in the documentation. And I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder, but you'll see a demo later of a new provisioning tool that we're starting to work on. And we'll hopefully get those last bits addressed at that time. Back to you, Gabe.
Great. Thanks. And for stateless logger, Kent, actually, I think that one's assigned to you. You want to touch on that?
Oh, yeah, that's me as well. Sorry. Yeah, so that was recently assigned to me. I'll give you the cliff notes on that. Anybody who's been running the so-called stateless platform, so anyone who's electing to run without Ceph and is providing their own alternative external database and object store like S3. Anybody who's been running that way has not been running the logger component because it has a dependency on Ceph. So we woke up one morning and a community member had contributed a stateless logger. Basically, it gives the option of opting into a log handler that implements an in-memory ring buffer. So what we're trying to do here essentially is give the option, let people opt into this alternate handler so that the logger can be brought back into play. And that way typically when people are running stateless, they configure their log spouts to ship their logs directly to an external service like Papertrail. And instead of the logger, this will allow people to start routing their logs to the logger once again. And that will make the logs available through the controller, through the API. Essentially, they weren't before if you were running stateless. So this should help that issue. There are a variety of other related issues. Basically, I'm making it my mission to squash any logging related difficulties, so that ties into this. So that's that.
Great. Thanks, Kent. With regard to internal service discovery, this is really solved and not just kind of solved, but dramatically, completely solved by the introduction of Kubernetes. And so that's going to be basically held off on Deis v2. There are a few other items that meet that same criteria. But next, I'll move on to the update service. Let Ian share a little bit about what we've shipped there recently.
Yeah, so we did ship the Grateful update logic, and that should exist. That actually needs a couple of releases because you can't ship. When we shipped the original release, you'd either have to upgrade from that release to that release or just not use it. So now that there's another release, it actually can be used. It works. But other than that, mostly focusing on the telemetry stuff. But I have sketched out, I started work on a small Go client. It's tiny, just to make use of those enhancements to JSC control. And tie it in with some Omaha stuff back end, so we could, essentially say, okay, there's a new release, set some rules, watch it update, not see your cluster go down, which does seem to work. Well, it doesn't seem to work. That does work, but definitely needs a lot more attention to arrive at something permanent. So that's kind of the state of it right now. Needs a little bit of client stuff and maybe some more community discussion about what that would look like in a final product.
Great, thanks, Ian. And I think this just goes to the idea that we want to make the update experience for the platform, improve it over time, and community feedback is going to be really important there. So Boersma, over to you for Deis push.
Right. Deis push is functionality we've been mumbling about for a long time, but haven't got done. Basically, the idea would be you could take something out of your local Docker graph, you built it however you needed to, and promote it as an application. This would probably be an adjunct rather than replace Deis pull, which is you have an image out there on a registry and you need to deploy it. So there's a fair amount of work to do there, but the real issues that have prevented us from implementing this so far are related to the Docker registry. We have some technical debt. We need to upgrade Docker, as we talked about earlier. We need to get on registry v2 and then re-implement this code path that we did that supports Deis pull right now. This is actually probably going to be a fairly high priority for the next release, and most of it needs to get done. I'm not sure that we'll be able to implement all of Deis push, but we're going to try. The first thing that does need to happen is we need to get off our backrev version of CoreOS, newer version of Docker, and finish the registry v2 stuff. That's all linked to on the roadmap there, so I don't really have any much more detail, but this is going to be a higher priority for 1.11.
Great, thanks, Matt. And with regard to the TTY broker, this is something that the community has been very emphatic about wanting. The truth is that a lot of the plumbing that needs to be built for this already exists in Kubernetes. If you've ever seen the kubectl exec command, you'll know what I'm referring to. So rather than try and implement this in the 1x line and then have to basically toss it and re-implement it inside of Kubernetes, we are going to wait until Kubernetes in order to get this working. So that's just sort of a trade-off that we're going to need to make as a team. And while I would love to ship something soon, it's not a trivial problem right now. With regard to the service broker, really, this is also something else that we're going to be tackling inside of the context of the Kubernetes and the V2. This is not something I'm hearing lots of users sort of screaming about, but we do think we can use things like the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API inside the context of Kubernetes to spin up things like databases and backing services as containerized services on Kubernetes, and then do explicit binding to those services in the context of a Deis add-ons style command, and that's really the ultimate goal there. So that's sort of it. For the roadmap. At this point, before we jump into the demo, I'd like to actually open it up to everyone on the line for any Q&A. I know we've gone through a lot of stuff. So any questions people have, now's the time. Also, if you do have questions, feel free to punch them into the chat here, or you can punch them in on IRC, and I'll leave a couple minutes here.
You want people to just jump in and open the mics and ask?
Yep, jump in, open mics and ask if you got anything.
I have a general question about Kubernetes.
Shoot.
Okay, as I understand it, Kubernetes is supposed to be used for homogeneous nodes, right? Or does it simulate the homogeneous node? If you have a non-homogeneous environment, if you had larger nodes and smaller nodes, can you spin up more Kubernetes on one node?
Yeah, I don't believe it requires homogeneous nodes. I believe that the kubelets are actually going to be reporting, available resources on each node as part of sort of the core scheduling construct. So I don't think that should be a problem. Though, if someone else knows more, please jump in. No other questions? I guess everyone is just really eager to hear Seth's demo. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Let's hand it over to Seth to show off Rigor, a new tool he's been working on.
Okay, so I've been with the Deis team for about 2 months now, and in that 2 months, I've really gotten good at provisioning clusters to test them, and it's quite the process. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So if you can see, this is the quick start page. Can everyone see that? So when you start to provision Deis, you're like, okay, this is a quick start document. So this should go pretty fast. So all of a sudden I'm checking out Git repository, generating SSH keys, making a discovery URL. And I have to pick a provider. Let's say I pick DigitalOcean. And then I have to do some other things. That looks like what I just did. Then I have to install some gems. And then I get into actually installing the Deis platform. Okay, starting an agent, exporting some environment variables. This is starting to get messy. And that takes a lot of just manual intervention and process to get going. And that doesn't even include like actually configuring the Deis client that developers will use to deploy applications to the cluster. So recently, I produced this design document in the Deis repository. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but it's kind of lengthy. But my proposal in here is that we build a provisioning tool that is not reinventing the wheel that like Terraform or other tools have brought into our industry, but kind of making an interface that's common for all these providers that we support with the Deis platform, and make it easy to stand up a demo cluster, and then eventually, as Kent mentioned, be able to provision a cluster that has all the best practices, topologies, built-in kind of number of nodes that you might need for the type of apps that you're running. Kind of build in all that knowledge at provisioning time and get that stood up as fast as possible and not have to go through any of this documentation that you see in our current Deis quick start documentation. So even though Butcher is really excited about Greek analogies, rigor actually comes from one of my passions, which is construction. And a rigor in construction is their role is to kind of figure out how to tie up and secure loads to be lifted into position by cranes or heavy lifting equipment. So it really is like they're critical in the process of creating buildings or deploying a new environment. And then Chris Armstrong had a good other analogy, which was riggers in like TV production or movie production kind of world. They set the stage, connect all the lights, kind of position everything, and get everything ready for the show, which would be having a Deis cluster for developers or people to use in your company. So we think that the name really fits well for what this component is all about. So with this design document, a new repository in the Deis space was created. It kind of gives you just a general idea of what this tool is supposed to be about. And I have a video. I love shows like Modern Marvels, or so you can watch something interesting if you're into construction or really tough fixes. So I do want to show what it looks like to use rigor right now, and it's still kind of in that proof of concept phase. You are guaranteed to run into some bugs because this has been working for me in the last 3 days or so, and then the rest of the team has started using it in the last two days. So it's fairly new even internally to the Deis project. But the idea is you have a two-step provisioning process. The first step is a configuration process, and I'll play this video. Hopefully everyone can see it. And the idea is you type in rigor configure. It starts asking questions, what type of version you want, and then where you want to deploy this cluster to. And I try to be smart about inspecting the environment variables that you've already set. So if you followed the quick start documentation halfway, and then we're like, oh, this rigor tool looks way better, you could actually launch this rigor configuration process halfway through. It also enables you to put in things like your SSH keys that you want to use for Deis. You could actually export Deis SSH key in this shell environment, and it would never ask you this question. So continuing on, it produces a file that then can be sourced, and I'll show that shortly. So come on now, type a little faster. Okay, so in here, these are all similar variables if you've provisioned a Deis cluster before in the past. These are all variables that may or may not be familiar to you. And if they're not familiar to you, they're probably variables that are involved in testing, at least using our internal acceptance tests. And so that's what like the test auth key or the test SSH key would be all about. And then, so once you have something configured, then we can get into the provisioning process. And the idea here is once you've been asked all those questions, there's no more user input in the rigor tool. So when I type in rigor provision, it will install the Deis client and the Deis CTL client into that .rigger directory, and it will also grab those units, set them up, and then it's actually running a Terraform deploy to DigitalOcean. Notice that I sped up the video a little bit here because I didn't want you all to wait. But I ran this. It took about 10 minutes to spin up this DigitalOcean cluster. And so now that the resources are provisioned in DigitalOcean, we get into the process of installing Deis and then actually starting it as well. And then once this is complete, you can actually look at that same configuration file that I was showing earlier, and some items have been added to it. So you'll notice that the Deis CTL tunnel is now in here. And if I actually source this file into my environment, then I can type in Deis CTL, which is not in my path, and I have the 191 Deis CTL, and I can access that cluster and start manipulating it. And then this gets us some nice things where we can actually use the Deis CLI to test that cluster as well. So if I type in rigor test and then pass in a type of test that we have, which is a smoke test, it's actually going to use the Deis CLI to actually deploy the example Go project into that cluster. Once again, I sped this up because I didn't want to have you all wait. But then I can source the same variable file and see that in the cluster, the testing app is still in the cluster. And then I can see that in the builder, there are references to that actually being built. And that's the end of my demo. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If you have input or otherwise, that design document that I have in the Deis issues would be a perfect place to jump in and ask me questions, or an IRC or whatever. If you have ideas of how to make the system better than what we have already going right now, I would love that input.
Yeah, great work, Seth. I just wanted to add to this. I think there are really two areas where people can contribute. This is a great way to jump into the project if you haven't yet. I think that one, we're defining the design spec right now, as Seth is referring to. We want to have an abstraction between rigor and then the contrib scripts directly, so we could use some input on that discussion. But I think aside from that, once that's defined, our community is a great mesh of experts on different cloud providers. And actually converting some of those scripts to be more resilient and then to hook into rigor, so that we can use rigor to provision on all the clouds. I think right now, Seth, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we support DigitalOcean, Vagrant development workflow, and then AWS. But obviously we want to add support for Azure and GCE and the other clouds we support as well. So, if you guys have been looking for a place to dive in and want to help out, this would probably be a pretty good one. It's a new tool, so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. As Seth said, we know there are bugs, we just don't know where they are. So,
yeah, and I will mention it this time. It's currently built all in Bash using a framework called Rerun, but it's kind of designed such that we can replace like the configuration step. That's ripe for rewrite and go, especially if we start to define better data structures. So we could have, like, Kent had an idea of having a rigor file called a rig file that maybe we could load. There's a lot of options we have, rewriting that part in Go, and then also just being able to export those variables, produce that environment variable file that the rest of the steps can use. So it's pretty pluggable as it stands right now.
Awesome. Well, Seth, that's amazing work, and sort of the applications of this are really widespread. Not just they go beyond making it easier for folks walking into the project and looking to spin up clusters. This has implications for upgrades. This has implications for different types of testing and end testing that we can be performing on the platform. So, really, really terrific work, and very excited to see it come to fruition. So, great. Well, I'll leave it open for any other questions. I think that's about the end of what we had to share today. We are planning on cutting the 1.10 release today, so expect to see that published shortly. And unless there's anything else, no. All right. Well, thanks everyone so much. Until next time.